Joining me now for Locked On Gators is John Garcia, Locked On's recruiting insider. And John, we have to start with the decommitment story because obviously Juwan Johnson was committed to Colorado, and Florida Gators fans are kind of like, well, that's done. He's a DB. He gets to play under Dion. And that's not the case anymore. He's decommitted from Colorado. He's scheduled an official visit with Florida for, I believe, June 2nd is when it's set. But how should Florida Gators fans feel about Juwan Johnson right now?
Yeah, they should feel excited. They're right back in the race. We know Corey Raymond has been on Johnson for quite some time, Louisiana guy. We know about all the staff ties there near the Bayou. And yes, LSU is in it, but I don't think this is a foregone conclusion for any program because, first of all, Johnson has shown a couple of cards in his own decision-making process that are a little outside the box, right? Committing to Colorado over LSU and Florida in the first place was a bit of a head scratcher, a head turning moment, I should say. And then decommitting one day after going to Colorado's spring game was another very interesting chess move in Johnson's case. So clearly he wants to do some due diligence here. And as you said, Brandon, he's going to take the official visit to Florida. And that's the only one he's set to this point. So I think clearly, even if something is going to happen sooner rather than later, Florida's going to at least have a final program-funded pitch to Johnson, under Corey Raymond, under Austin Armstrong. Billy Napier will get involved and has been involved simultaneously. So this is the type of prospect that you got to stay on because, there's a lot of conversation about a window being relatively short. So I think this becomes a bit of a Florida versus LSU type of battle, which we have seen in the past, specifically for Louisianans and specifically in the secondary. And Florida isn't, over in those pursuits. So I do think it's something that the fan base should very much pay attention to. Now, that said, LSU probably the favorite. From the moment he decommitted, we started to hear some LSU buzz, but then he set the Florida visit. So it's clear that both of these coaching staffs were not very fazed by that initial commitment to Dion and Colorado, and they stayed with it through Johnson, and that's paid off because just a couple months later, he is now back on the market. Now, there are other schools trying to stay in the race, Texas A&M. He had a huge scholarship offer list coming out of LCA this past year where he plays quarterback. He's just kind of a do-it-all player who's projected at receiver or defensive back, depending on the program. Of course, at UF, it is going to be on defense. And that's where Johnson is sort of leaning. And as you said, when he picked Colorado, that was kind of okay, this is where it does make some sense. But even though he says he's considering the Buffs moving forward, I think this is more of a classic SEC battle. Do you stay home or do you go to the program that has recruited your home state very well with the guy who is most known for developing DBs in your home state in Corey Raymond? So I think this will be a fun back and forth between these two coaching staffs, and we'll see what Johnson does from a visit perspective beyond the Florida official. Does he set LSU? Does he just take a short drive from Lafayette down to Baton Rouge? However that plays out going forward will be interesting. Could another school get involved now that he's back on the market? I think all of these scenarios are in play, but no doubt Raymond and company were on him throughout that Colorado verbal commitment and obviously made quick work of logistics and visit plans after he decommitted over the weekend, and they've already got an official visit set for early June. So even if that's where the process is going to end, you've got another 6 weeks or so to do your work in between and obviously try to hit an apex and roll out that red carpet when June rolls around.
What are the odds that he went to that spring game and he was like, hell no, it's too cold?
It was snowing. It was snowing in I was going to say in Denver, in Boulder, Colorado. And it was sort of a surprise. I know the forecast was supposed to be nice and very springy, if that makes sense. And then the 24 hours prior to the game, snow came, and all of a sudden it became a whole different level of spectacle relative to Prime and that program. So yeah, there's a possibility for that. You're in one of two camps as a Southerner who goes to a cold place. And look, I went to grad school in Syracuse and I'm from Miami, so I get it. You either embrace it and say, wow, this is so different, that I'm just going to dive all into it and just take it for what it is, or you absolutely hate it. There's really no in between there. So I can't speak for Johnson in his specific experience, but yeah, being from Lafayette, Louisiana, and going to watch your future team at the time play in the snow has to be pretty stark for any of these Southern recruits. So we'll see. We'll see how that factors in. Yeah, I don't think Colorado is going to stay in it as much as Johnson is giving them the courtesy to remain in the hunt. But yeah, you got to wonder. I think after the fact, after he makes this next commitment, we can double back and say, hey, how was that snow? How did that factor into things? Because he obviously won't get that in SEC country, where he's most likely to end up at the next level.
Yeah, I played a lot of football in the snow just because, I'm from New York. I had teammates that were from New York and were like, no. So
Yeah.
I don't blame anybody from Lafayette. It's just like, no, not for me. I don't like it. But with so much of this Florida Gators coaching staff having experience in the state of Louisiana, and I mean Lafayette specifically, obviously, how does that kind of play into his recruitment where yeah, LSU's his home state school, but you've still got a taste of Louisiana with you. Not as good gumbo, I know that, but you still got a taste of Louisiana with you, with not just the staff, but the roster. Like you said, like they've gone into Louisiana and taken players before. So how does that kind of play into this dynamic of Florida versus LSU?
Well, it creates a level of comfort, and all Colorado jokes aside, he's already made a firm decision to leave not only the state but the whole footprint. So there's already sort of the at least planning just from a family standpoint. Hey, I'm going far away for my college football. Obviously, that has changed, and it will be much closer to home, we think, going forward. But it's another layer of comfort that Johnson's going to have if he does elect to play his college football out of state. And look, LSU was in this from the beginning as well. It's not like LSU offered after he committed to Colorado and began pushing after that point. LSU was already very much in the conversation for Johnson before that somewhat surprising Colorado verbal commitment. So it's not like other scenarios where LSU comes in late for Louisiana and they say, oh, well, this is where I wanted to go the whole time. It's not that simple. And to go off of that, as you said, there's so many ties to the state of Louisiana from the roster and the coaching standpoint in Gainesville. And then you're still, in the SEC, you're still very familiar with what you're up against. So I do think that this is more of a it's more than a puncher's chance scenario for Florida. It's not a shot in the dark. You're not the dark horse. I think this is closer to a coin flip than maybe the optics would suggest, specifically with Florida going up into Louisiana. And again, specifically in the secondary with Raymond, who again has recruited and developed more great Louisiana natives than maybe any other secondary coach in this country.
Today's episode of Locked On Gators is brought to you by Built Bar. It is a couple days away from May at this point. If you're trying to get that final stretch of summer bod, if you're trying to just trim a little bit of baby fat still, trying to show a little bit of fat, trying to bulk up a tiny bit, add Built Bar into your plan. They've got coated in 100% chocolate, first of all, most important. Most bars have 130 calories, 4 net carbs, 17 grams of protein. You can get them online at builtorbuiltbar.com, or now you can go into your local Walmart or Sam's Club and get yourself that Built Bar. Flipping to the offensive side of the ball, yeah, Juwan Johnson plays offense too, but we know we're talking about him as a defender. But to the offensive side of the ball, and as polar opposite as Juwan Johnson as you can get, offensive lineman with Fletcher Wetphal, who we've spoken about him before, but what kind of player do you think he projects to be at the, we'll say college level, but ideally SEC level?
Yeah, this is a moldable prospect. There's a lot of tangibles that you can pull, kind of like Johnson, that will eventually translate into something, so somewhat of a stalwart on your offensive line one day. Johnson, like we said, quarterback, receiver, does everything. We project him at DB once it all comes together. With Wetphal, two-way lineman, and just so darn physical. Not to mention 6'8", well over 300 pounds. So you talk about tools and what you can work with. Any trench coach in America on either side of the ball is going to feel like they can do some things with Wetphal. And look, that's why his offer list has blown up. He's been coveted by a lot of big time programs, including the Gators, for quite some time because of that ability. He's great in the phone booth. Obviously, has a great length and extension, which really translates on the offensive line as a blocker. More comfortable run blocking than pass blocking today, which is usually the case anyway. So for him, it's going to be about adding that technique, dropping the pad level, because at 6'8", that's always going to be something that pops up, even though we see some NFL tackles at 6'7", 6'8", that have had a lot of success in faster, more wide open zone blocking type schemes like Florida wants to implement more as this Napier staff gets settled. So there's a lot to like and a lot to work with. One of the rare prospects, Brandon, where you've got a high floor because of the frame, the physicality, but also a high ceiling because he's got room to improve from a technical standpoint and from a pad level standpoint. So I just think he's one of these obvious prospects that you don't have to dig into very much to say, okay, I see why the SEC and the Big Ten, even the Pac-12, is all over this kid coming out of Virginia. So I do think it's going to be a fascinating recruitment, and he's got a lot of schools under consideration ahead of that April 30th cut that he's going to make. But I do think Florida will make that cut. 2 visits in the last few months or so, both of them multi-day, family there with him on both trips. The 2 O-line coach approach is obviously something that for a kid who needs to advance his technique, something that he's going to buy into. That two-way ability just screams SEC with that physicality indicator as well. So, yeah, I think Florida is going to make this top 5 when it comes out here in a couple days, and then they're going to contend official visits and then a preseason decision thereafter. Even though, as you talked about pre-show, heavy list of contenders here for Wetphal.
Yeah, with that list being, Georgia, Auburn, Clemson, SEC schools, Pac-12 schools, probably international too at this point. But how could Florida kind of separate themselves in this recruitment outside of the obvious offensive line coaching staff is incredible. But outside of that, how can Florida kind of try to separate for Fletcher?
I think for him, it's going to be really about sitting down on the next batch of visits, which will probably be officials, and really digging into the projection. Am I a tackle here? Am I a guard here? Am I a right tackle here? What does this really look like? And to me, the staff that puts together the best development plan should be the one that wins out. And look, there's a lot of SEC schools within his current group, which is a top 10, right? You mentioned Georgia, Auburn, Arkansas is in there. Obviously Florida, and we might as well throw Clemson in there as that type of program from a recruiting and geographical standpoint. So I do think he's going to get similar pitches, but at Florida, I do think there's some uniqueness, not only in the ability to develop and get that focus with 2 coaches, which is something Wetphal has gone on record with as a strong selling point for the Gators, but obviously the need and that ability to potentially ascend in relatively short order. Some of the other programs that we've listed pretty set along the offensive line. So even though I do think Wetphal is very much keyed in on his own potential development, nobody wants to sit for 2, 3, 4 years if they don't have to. Develop me while I play, right? So I do think that combination of a very specific approach at Florida with the 2 O-line coaches, the style, the scheme, and I think the path to playing time is pretty solid. This is not a group under Napier that has recruited a lot of O-linemen by volume. So I do think that's something that could be appealing, in addition to just the national appeal of joining this class of 24 at Florida. There's considerable buzz there for the Gators. I was talking to Mario Craver a couple weekends ago, receiver out of Alabama, who Florida's in good shape for. And he's like, man, you can't deny the buzz of this 24 class. It started with DJ Lagway, and it has expanded since that point. So that's something that will resonate. And obviously, any offensive target becomes a guy you feel just a little bit better about with that initial battery on board in Lagway and Napier and the rest of the offensive commitment. So I think all of those points will help Florida to stay in the race and grab an official, which will be, in my opinion, really critical for a kid who wants to make a summer decision.
Yeah, and before I let you go, it is wild to me how when we're talking about someone like Fletcher Wetphal, you're like, oh, like the tools, like the height, the length, the weight, the athleticism for players, and all this stuff. And you're like, oh, projecting it to the next level. And obviously, we're recording this the morning of the NFL draft. And it is just insane to me that we can be 3, 4, even 5 years down the line with some of these guys and still go, yeah, but you're talking about the physical tools that they bring when you can put it all together. And it's just time is a flat circle. That's all I'm realizing as we're doing this. But thank you so much, John. This was John Garcia, Locked On's recruiting insider, and catch him all throughout the Locked On College channel and still every week so far in 2023.
Yes, sir.